Our reading this morning comes from the book of Exodus. We begin with chapter 1, verse 8, and continue on into chapter 2. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard work in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. And then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Well, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Last week we heard just a little bit from the story of Joseph, favorite son of his father, resented by his brothers, who faked his death and sold him into slavery. Joseph, the dreamer and interpreter of dreams, whose gift eventually brought him to the pinnacle of power in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. Joseph, whose family fell on hard times back home and traveled to Egypt, hoping to escape starvation, his siblings finding themselves in front of the brother they betrayed and at his mercy. Joseph, who embraced and forgave them and made for his family a new home with ample food and a promising future. Over time, that family of immigrants became great in numbers. In fact, their numbers grew to become a significant portion of the Egyptian population. What also grew in proportion to their population was fear. More and more, the Egyptians feared the Hebrews. We humans, it seems, are ever so prone to fear one another. We're told in the book of Exodus that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Pharaoh was afraid. "Look," he said, "the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. They might become so numerous and so powerful, they might, in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us. And they might escape from the land, their departure being of as great a consequence as war, because as much of a threat as they were, these Israelites provided a labor force upon which the Egyptian economy was dependent. So Pharaoh conspired to oppress the Israelites so they would become weak and less of a threat." I doubt that fear of the Israelites developed overnight. I can imagine Pharaoh and the Egyptian elite wringing their hands for some time over the possible impact of this growing minority and the impact it might have on their Egyptian language and their Egyptian culture. John Calvin, one of the most influential leaders of the Protestant Reformation, wrote in response to this very story. Early in the 16th century, he said that when we have once determined to provide for our own advantage, or quiet, or safety, we ask not the question whether we are doing right or wrong. It is a wicked kind of cunning, Calvin said, unjustly to molest others for our own security. I fear this or that person because he both has the means of injuring me and I am uncertain of his disposition toward me. Therefore, in order that I may be safe from harm, I will endeavor by every possible means to oppress him. From this source, Calvin said, almost all wars proceed. Because whilst every prince fears his neighbor, this fear so fills him with apprehension, he concluded, that he does not hesitate to cover the earth with human blood. John Calvin, in the 16th century. And covering the earth with blood is exactly what Pharaoh conspired to do. Simply oppressing the Israelites was not working. The greater the oppression, the greater grew their numbers. So Pharaoh hatched his plan, commanding the midwives to kill the Hebrew babies if they were boys. And of course, we heard the midwives did not comply. Those Israelite women were so strong that they delivered before the midwives could get there, they said. So Pharaoh commanded all his people to throw every Hebrew boy that's born into the Nile. And the story that follows is, of course, one of the more familiar stories in the Bible. Moses is born. Fearing that he will be killed, his mother first hides him for 3 months, then carefully makes a basket that will not leak and hides him among the reeds at the edge of the Nile. But Moses' sister stayed close by to see what would happen. Pharaoh's daughter finds him and rescues him, hires Moses' mother to be his nurse, and raises him as her own son. So it's ironic that it was her father who ordered the death of all male Hebrew babies, including the child of his daughter. The trigger for all these events was fear. Fear that grew within Pharaoh and spread throughout Egypt like a cancer moves through a body. Now, I know a little bit about cancer. My mother and father died of it. My son Daniel, now a healthy 36-year-old, was diagnosed at age 4 with leukemia. And to top it off, I had surgery for prostate cancer 4 years ago. So I know a little bit about cancer. Cancer does its thing quietly at first, out of view, unnoticed. And then, with most cancers, symptoms begin to appear. They can fool us. We write it off as something else. We say it will pass. There's no reason for alarm. And then finally, that cancer shows itself for what it is. And what do we do now? Well, most of us would choose to rid ourselves of that cancer and opt for chemotherapy or radiation or surgery. At that point, cancer is really not something that you can ignore. Do nothing, and in the end it will kill you. Of course, it would have been better not to ignore the symptoms in the first place. Well, there has been and there is a cancer growing in our nation. It's not new. Racism is a chronic condition that we acquired a very long time ago. The cancer growing now is really two cancers. They go by the names fear and hatred. And they feed off of each other. They're very stealthy. They grow quickly and quietly for a very long time until it's impossible not to see and feel the symptoms. We ignore those symptoms at our peril. The Klan and Nazis marching in our streets, rallying, are the unmistakable symptoms of those companion cancers of fear and hatred. Well, now is the time to visit the doctor and start treatment before it spreads through the body. Now is the time to go after fear and hate. Now is the time to say no. Now is the time to reject fear and hate and go after it with all of the healing doses of understanding, of respect and love. All that we can muster. The story of Moses' birth contains within it a warning that the price of fear and hate is simply too high a price to pay. We believe that God has a vision for the world. We do. And that God has a vision for us that is free of hatred and fear, injustice and violence. And yet that vision comes up against some pretty stiff resistance. The story of Moses is one story of God's vision breaking into the lives and the history of the Hebrew people. And it's one story of powers that seek to kill off that vision. We get to write our own story. Will that cancer continue to grow, unchallenged and unchecked? Or will our story be one of good people, doing what is right even when the wrong can seem so strong? God does work through good people. People like you and me who allow God to work through us when we choose to help, not hurt, when we choose caring over fear, and when we choose healing over hate. Amen. And now, not because